I'm Lori Weeks, and I'm a professor at Dalhousie University. I'm a gerontologist. My background is in aging, and I'm a social scientist. My academic home is in the School of Nursing, where I teach a lot of content on aging and research methods and program planning and evaluation. And a chunk of my time is spent supervising research projects that master's and doctoral students do, primarily at Dalhousie University. So I've been interested in issues around planning and preferences for housing for a very long time, specifically housing for older people. So all the way back to my master's degree, which was done in the mid 90s, I was interested in what do older people want for housing and care options in the future. So it's a long time ago, but I clearly remembered at that time the older people that were part of my study talked about wanting ways to stay in their own homes with support, basically, and not always having to rely on family members and friends, being able to have other supports around them so that they could remain living in their own homes. So that was kind of my initial experiences with this topic as a whole. After that time, I spent a lot of time learning about the entire kind of array of care and supports for older people, and I've done research on everything from community-based supports like adult day programs and home care all the way through to assisted living and nursing homes to support older people and their caregivers. But housing has been really a central theme in that, but I think I would kind of extend it to housing plus care, and that's what I kind of intend to talk about a little bit more, that we don't want to think about just housing on its own and just care on its own. So housing would be just simply building housing, that you build housing and it's apartments, but there's not any kind of integrated care or supports within that. And on the other extreme, I think we're pretty good at building long-term care, but it's really about the care and not so much about the design of the housing to support, independence and really feeling like home. So I think I've been really interested in kind of that melding of housing plus care and support. So many years ago now, probably about 10 years ago, I would say, there was a group in Prince Edward Island that was interested in developing co-housing. So a particular form of housing that involves an intentional community where people come together and want to live in close proximity to each other, have their own independent living units, but a lot of sharing of spaces, indoor and outdoor spaces, and connection with each other and mutual support. So, it's been an idea that really developed in Denmark and has kind of expanded through other parts of the world. It's not particularly common yet in Canada, especially in Eastern Canada. There's more examples of this, especially in British Columbia. So at that time, I thought, well, they want me to come and talk about co-housing, which I didn't know a lot about. I'd done research on housing for seniors. So at that time, I spent some time reading about what do we know about co-housing. So unfortunately, that group wasn't successful in developing co-housing, but it really kind of led me on a path of getting connected with other researchers who were interested in studying co-housing, and we've done several studies now in Canada and reviewing the literature on co-housing. So that has been something that I will really draw on what we've learned about co-housing and how that can, those concepts of mutual support, I think I will really draw on that to talk about that at the meeting in November, which is specifically about home sharing. So it's a different type of housing, but I think that there's a lot of common aspects of that, where this is housing where we're trying to reduce social isolation and reduce people who are just reduce the prevalence of older people, especially just living on their own. We know in Canada that we have a lot of older people. We have a lot of older people living alone. And interestingly, we have a really high rate of home ownership, especially in smaller towns and rural places. So older people especially are very likely to own their own home. So we often find that later in life, they really are what the academic term is called overhousing. So people who are living in a home that was once, meeting their needs when there was a lot of people living there, if they had a large family or a multi-generational family, but often in later life, they're it, or maybe there's one or two people living in this home. So I'm really interested in this idea of home sharing, even though I am not an expert in home sharing. We have a little bit of evidence about people's interest in it from prior research that I was involved with in the mid-2000s, where we were in Atlantic Canada, asking older people what kinds of forms of housing would they be interested in, and especially from a financial perspective. What kinds of things could make housing more affordable for you? And home sharing, interestingly, was one of the options we asked about. And about 20% of the people said that it might be something they would be interested in doing at some point. So it's not a lot of evidence, but it showed us a few things, that it's not something that everyone would be interested in doing, but a certain proportion of people might be interested in that. And there seems to be, I think from my reading of the literature, which there's not an extensive body of knowledge on home sharing, especially intergenerational home sharing, where it's specifically for older people who are overhoused and have their own home and want to stay there, and younger people who might be students or young professionals, people working in the area who can't afford, to buy their own home. So this way of kind of matching up younger people and older people to share, it's really a win-win. The older person has someone, they're not alone anymore. The younger person typically pays them some money to live there and or contributes some of their time, and that could simply be providing companionship or helping with chores around the home, and that can be really advantageous for both people. So I think it's a really interesting concept. I think it's something that could be, very useful. And unlike co-housing, as much as I think co-housing is a really compelling model, and I'm very supportive of co-housing, and our research has showed a lot of the benefits of co-housing, and we'd like to further establish that in the future. There's a lot of challenges in developing co-housing because typically a group of people come together who have similar values and want to begin a co-housing community. It can be many years from that time till first they make a lot of decisions about what they'd like this community to be like socially and physically, finding land, renovating an existing structure, or building a structure from scratch, the design of it, what do we want this thing to look like. That can take years from kind of the idea and the concept to completion. And it happens in Canada. But home sharing is kind of something that the infrastructure is already there. So it's really kind of something that I think could help a lot quickly, where, if we can kind of match people up. So some of the reading that I've been doing recently on home sharing, they kind of talk about how important it is to have some kind of an organization that really helps to do that match, to really document who wants to be a homeowner that wants to be part of this, and what they're looking for, what their needs are, what the space is like. And also the younger people, what are they looking for? What are they willing to contribute? What kind of a context do they want to live in? So that organization seems really key to really match those people up, but not just do that initial matching, but to really provide support throughout. And I think that that's one of the things that the conference organizers wanted me to comment a bit on. So I certainly have found some evidence in the literature that having that kind of organization to be able to provide support when things might not go well, if there's some conflict, if it's not working very well. I read some research around how often they try informally, the homeowner often tries informally to make changes if things aren't going perfectly, but having that support of an organization, I think, is really crucial because it's not going to work perfectly all of the time. So I think having some recourse. Also, interestingly, I was reading that how for homeowners, they find that it's a little less a little less threatening for them maybe than choosing to just simply like rent a part of their house and have a tenant living in their home. They felt a little more protected maybe by having it as a home share arrangement. The kind of regulations that that might fall under is different if you're renting your part of your home versus participating in a home sharing arrangement. So I think that that's something interesting to think about. There's not a lot of research on this topic of home sharing, but there's starting to be some research on intergenerational home sharing. So older people who own a home and younger people, whether it's students or young professionals or workers looking for a place to live. So the research that had been done in France that I read focused a lot on the importance of an organization, and they tend to be nonprofit organizations where the people who use the services, both the homeowner and the younger people, pay quite a small fee to be able to use that service. There was also some mention that that's a bit of a challenge of additional funding that these nonprofit organizations probably need to raise through fundraising or possibly funding through governments to be able to provide this service. But it seemed extremely crucial. So helping to identify and document who is interested in this and matching people up and developing what they called a charter. So for both people, kind of the agreement of what is this arrangement going to look like, and what is each person going to do, and what are the expectations. So that was an interesting word. I'm not sure if in Canada we would use that word of a charter, but that was the word that they used in France to talk about that agreement. And then, that organization staff would be able to help out if any conflicts really arise. One interesting thing in that study that was kind of a comment that kind of stood out to me, that there were a lot more younger people who were interested in this than older people willing to share their own home. And that made me think a little bit about that was in a context in France. I kind of wondered in Canada, if we asked older people how many of them would be interested in this kind of arrangement, how many of them would be interested. And if we asked students in Canada, how many students would be interested. And it does, I think logically, I would hypothesize that we probably would have a similar situation where, we might have more interest in people wanting to be the person going into someone's home versus the person, wanting someone to come into their home. So that would be an interesting thing to explore. Many years ago, we did a study on seniors housing in Atlantic Canada, and home sharing was one of the options that we included. It was just one question among many, and about 20% of the people in our survey who were older adults said that it might be something they were interested in exploring in the future. So it's not going to be something that all older adults are interested in, but I think we need to expand the different kinds of housing options and arrangements that we have available. But it seems like it could be a mutually beneficial thing, both for older people and younger people. So in about 2005, I was part of a large study in Atlantic Canada called the ASHRA, the Atlantic Seniors Housing Research Alliance. And we surveyed people who were 65 and older at that time. So when we did the survey, it was about 2007, when we would have been in 2007, 2008, when we administered the survey in Atlantic Canada. And they were 65 and older at the time. So that's the one where, about 20%, said they might be interested in this kind of arrangement of home sharing. So we do need, there's definitely been changes since then. There's a whole new group of people who are 65 and older that weren't that age at that point, who are baby boomers. We always knew that there was a bit of a gap in the research we were doing, and that we really should have collected more information from younger people to really kind of think about the future. Some of the research that I've been reading in Europe has really identified that baby boomers do have different characteristics than previous generations, like than their parents. They tend to want to be more engaged in these new kind of models of housing. They want to be really active citizens as a whole, and really, you know, to support more of a collective kind of attitude maybe than very individualistic. So there that those trends could be things that kind of increase the likelihood of older people who do own a home to be more interested and engaged in this kind of arrangement potentially. Yeah. I found one very recent study on home sharing in Canada. In Ontario, it seems to have been quite a bit of interest in this. So universities in Toronto had a pilot project where there was matching between students and seniors. Universities are really this is really on their radar, and there's a lot of media stories now about how it's really the university is really obliged to help ensure that their students have access to affordable housing. I don't know if that has always been the case, where it really the onus is really on the universities themselves to figure this out. So universities are really motivated to try to come up with some alternate arrangements that are affordable for their students. So there was a pilot project done in the Toronto area with 3 universities, York, University of Toronto, and Toronto Metropolitan University. There was also a project that was done at McMaster University. The study, though, so this study talked about these other examples in Ontario, but the study was specifically about Queen's University in Kingston, where they did a survey, interestingly, of graduate students. And that was kind of significant to me on many levels as a gerontologist. They felt that graduate students, they're by definition a little older than undergraduate students. They might be more interested, have more life experience, and kind of want that kind of alternative arrangement versus living in a dorm or living in a home or apartment with 10 other undergraduate students. So it was curious to me that they did a survey of graduate students and really asked them, if this was available, would it be something that you were interested in? So it was both, would you be interested, but also paid attention to who are these students that might be interested in this kind of model of housing. So about 55% really didn't have any interest in this at all. There was 13% who were really interested. So if it was available, they would be very interested in pursuing that. And the rest were somewhere in the middle. It might be something of interest to them. So that was interesting. They did find, and other studies that are available have also showed that students, young people who've had significant exposure through work, through volunteering, even through family experiences with older people, were more interested in pursuing this kind of living arrangement. And as a gerontologist, that makes perfect sense to me. Those students who show an interest in studying aging and wanting to work with older people in some way in the future often have had significant experience, as I said, with older people, growing up around them, maybe living with older members of their family or in their community, working with older people, volunteering with older people. So the same trend showed up with these students. The ones that had that in their background were more likely to indicate that this might be something that they're interested in doing. So I was really reflecting on that and how, this is a really important concept, because I do believe that bringing generations together is really valuable for society. I think when we segregate people by age and there's not that connection between multiple generations, I think that I don't think it's good for us as a people. I think we really need to celebrate all of the different things that different people of different ages contribute to society. And I think it leads to a lot of ageism when we really separate young people from older adults. So this is a nice idea that can bring together generations, but kind of dependent on previous experiences, with other age groups. So I think that's kind of an important aspect of this. In that study that they did at Queen's University in Kingston, they looked at the different characteristics of of the graduate students who would be interested in this. And there was definitely a financial component. So the students who said that they currently paid $500 a month or less in rent were more likely to indicate this as a housing option for them. So on the surface, that might seem like it doesn't make sense. But what it said to me was that the students that had more money probably were paying more rent and probably could afford to pay more rent and were quite happy where they were. The ones who were paying $500 a month or less were probably couldn't afford any more than that. We're probably in a situation where they had a lot of roommates, and they did find that there was kind of this connection between more roommates and wanting a combination of more roommates and not having much money. They were more interested in the concept of like home sharing. So I think there's definitely an affordability component there where the students with fewer financial resources would be more likely to consider something like home sharing. In the study that they did in Kingston, interestingly, 53% of those graduate students said that the university should be promoting this as a form of housing. They should be involved in, figuring out these arrangements. Maybe they are the organization that helps facilitate the match and provide support during it. So as I saw in some other research in Europe, it was nonprofit organizations who are really the facilitator. Maybe the university, can be a facilitator of these, but I do think that that's support. It's not just the match. I think it's the support if things don't go well. I do think that still needs to be there. So maybe universities will be developing a more enhanced role in these kind of arrangements to support their students. Even though we don't have a lot of research yet on home sharing in Canada, especially intergenerational home sharing, I think we can kind of extend what we know about the benefits of people living, with others around them to provide care and support. So we know that social isolation is a big problem among older people in Canada. We have a lot of people who live alone, especially women who live alone in later life. So we know that can cause all kinds of challenges. With some of the research I've been involved with in co-housing, some of the things that really does for people is you have people around you to check on you and support you. So a lot of the co-housing communities overtly have, ways to provide to ensure that people are okay, if that's just very informally checking in on people. We've heard stories of people who, after coming home from hospital, living in an intentional community where you know your neighbors and you support your neighbors, where they're able to come home sooner and receive kind of check-ins and meal support from their neighbors. One of our team members actually lives in a co-housing community in BC, and she, after surgery, even though she understood all the aspects of it, she really lived it when she came home after having an operation. And every night, one of her neighbors came in and checked on her and brought her a meal. And that meant a lot to her in terms of her mental well-being and her physical well-being. Lots of other things too. When you live in community with people and have others around you, you tend to eat better. You have people to talk to and engage with, and we know that those are really good things. There's also a bit of peer pressure where, if there's things going on, having other people kind of encouraging you to do things and, not just be isolated. So we know there's a lot of benefits there. So ultimately, the idea is to try to encourage people to be healthy and able to stay in their own homes as long as they are wanting to do that and can safely do that. So that can have huge ramifications for our healthcare system and not requiring people to live in higher, more expensive forms of healthcare. So utilization of our acute care system, utilization of our long-term care system. So if we can do anything to try to support people to be healthy and remain living in the community, those would be really advantageous. So I do think there's some aspects of home sharing that can really help with doing those things. So some people who've written about home sharing, more from a theoretical perspective, really feel that, anytime when we have people who are not lonely and living, with another person in their home, it should result in better health for the older person. But we don't really have that data yet in Canada. So ideally, what we will do is when people do engage in these kind of home sharing relationships where we really follow people over time. So what are the short-term impacts on their mental well-being, on their physical well-being, on their health status as a whole? And then what impact does that have in the long term? So does that help people to stay in their homes longer? Does it keep them healthier? Do they use the hospital less? Are they, less likely to go to a long-term care facility at all, or would that be delayed? We don't have that data yet in Canada. I think this concept, especially of intergenerational home sharing, is quite new. From what I have read, it's a concept that seems to have emerged out of Spain, interestingly enough, in the mid-1990s. So this hasn't been around a whole lot of time, and there's just very new studies just in Canada about, what we know a little bit about this and people's preferences, but we don't really have data yet about the long-term effects of this. Theoretically, it seems to be something that's very promising, given what we know about the importance of connection and support from other people. So I would expect that we would have a positive impact on health and a reduction in health service utilization. I don't have that data, but we really should implement longitudinal studies to be able to document that. What can we do at a systems level to encourage home sharing? Because I do think it's worth encouraging. I do think there are mutual benefits for older people and younger people through encouraging this kind of housing that I think could be implemented quickly. And I think that's really important. I think we do have such, low rates of rentals available, and, affordability is a big challenge. So I do think this is something we could do relatively quickly. So to encourage this, I do think having that organizational support, where there is an organization that is involved in identifying who is interested in this and helping match people and supporting that over time. So I do think that organizational support is absolutely necessary. In the States, there was one article I read where they talked about one way to encourage this is to, for older people who engage in home sharing, to give them reductions in property tax, for example. It could be an incentive to have older people engage in this kind of thing. The other thing is to ensure that there's nothing in terms of our regulations or zoning that would prevent it. So I was even reflecting on a sign in the condo building that I live in Halifax, where we now don't have short-term rentals in our building because it violates some principles around our documents of our condo corporation around being single family homes. And I don't know if you were in a home sharing arrangement that could potentially violate the codes of condominiums, for example, in Halifax. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's something to really consider, whether there could be any barriers in terms of regulations or zoning around preventing a home sharing kind of arrangement. So I think that we do need to look at some of those things and make sure that there's not some barriers around implementing this kind of thing. So what can organizations do to encourage or support home sharing? Well, I think sharing information about what it is. So, I think when people have never heard of something, they're not really sure what it is, I think that's a problem. So I think awareness raising is really important. So really explaining to the public what is this thing, and what does it entail, and how could it operate. So I think awareness raising is really important. I think anytime, if you're wanting to encourage this between older people and younger people as a whole, any kind of activities where you can engage multiple generations together, I think can be helpful, because we do know that younger people who do have more exposure to older people would be more interested in engaging in this kind of housing. So anytime you can bring together multiple generations, I think that could support this kind of a concept to evolve. And as I mentioned before, having organizational support, I think, is absolutely crucial. So I did find evidence that there are websites online. I don't know, how extensive the work that they do is, but there's organizations in many countries now that are for supporting home sharing arrangements. There was a Canadian website, and it included websites to multiple provinces in Canada that seem to have some organizational support for, developing home sharing arrangements. So I think that those kinds of organizations are really necessary for this to work really well. So I think at a community level, bringing together stakeholders who really have an interest in this kind of concept, both from organizations supporting older people in terms of developing new models of housing and housing arrangements and providing supports for older people to live longer in their own homes, and also organizations supporting young people and organizations that are trying to address homelessness and address housing affordability, for everyone, but especially for young people, whether that's students or people who are working, who are younger and just can't afford, to purchase something in this housing market or even afford to rent, honestly. So, groups that are interested in supporting all of those different stakeholders that are interested in this issue and coming together to find out what are things that they can do to join an organization or start an organization to develop and support home sharing in the community. So why is this not very common right now? We know it isn't particularly common at the moment. So why isn't it very common? I think often when people aren't familiar with something and don't have experience with it, it's something that we naturally probably fear a little bit. In our study that we did in the mid-2000s, we did find that first when we told people about here's some different housing options, would you be interested in this? If they had never heard of it before, those tended to be ones that they weren't as likely to choose. But if it was something very familiar to them, they were and more aware of it, then they seem to be more interested in possibly saying that would be something they would consider. So I think with new ideas like this, we know that this hasn't been around very long in other countries, let alone here. So I think, we need to kind of raise awareness about these kind of things. When my, when my parents were young and growing up in rural PEI, and if they were going to go to higher education, they couldn't do that in rural PEI. They had to move to a larger town to just finish high school, first of all. So, many young people, teenagers, would move into, Charlottetown to go to a college or a university. And at that time, they boarded. There was people who owned a home in the city, and they rented rooms in their houses to students. And many of my relatives, still will have lots of stories about their experiences of living in a boarding house. My great aunt actually ran a boarding house for years after her husband died, and she couldn't run the farm on her own, so she sold the farm and she bought a house in Charlottetown, and for years she rented rooms to boarders, many of my relatives, but many other people. So that was very common at that time. It wasn't common for young people to have an apartment on their own. Maybe there just wasn't that kind of housing stock available at the time. So that kind of disappeared, I think, and we changed to having young people living in apartments and often sharing apartments with younger people versus living in a home that someone else owned, and they would provide some services like cooking for you, and you just had your room. So that really went away. I don't know many people of my generation who had an experience boarding. It was very, very rare, but living in apartments, sure, but not boarding. So this concept of home sharing is kind of sounds a little bit like boarding. It's a different arrangement. It's not quite the same thing as boarding, but in some ways it has some elements of that too. So it seems like in some ways it's kind of come full circle, that it's a gap. You know, we have people who are overhoused and have larger homes, and we have young people who don't have access to housing. So it feels a little bit like that in a different context, in a different time. But you know, maybe that we can think about that era and kind of why did that go away, and then why is it coming back right now?